maybe we could officially begin.
With pleasure and welcome everyone. So Shira Backer is Leon Levy, assistant curator at the Jewish Museum. Maybe some of you saw the museum's recent exhibition, Louise Bourgeois, Freud's Daughter. It bore Shira's curatorial touch, as did Martha Rossler, Irrespective, and We Fight to Build a Free World, an exhibition by Jonathan Horowitz. Shira came to the Jewish Museum in 2016 from the American Federation of Arts, where she also lent her talents as assistant curator. We are thrilled to have her squire us around the museum's current and much touted show, The Hair with Amber Eyes, which she curated in collaboration with curator Stephen Brown and with Edmund Duvall, author of the best-selling 2010 memoir that inspired the exhibition. Shira, thank you so much for sharing your expert insights with us today, and we're ready to tour.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming to this virtual tour. And I was saying before all of you arrived, on the one hand, it's kind of prescient that this ended up being planned as a virtual tour, given what's going on right now with Omicron. But also, I will say this is really an exhibition that you will gain a lot by seeing it in person. And I do hope that many of you, or perhaps all of you, will have an opportunity to do so at some point this spring. So the reasons I say it's kind of great to see in person, this exhibition is very engaged with the architecture of our space. We are, for those of you who don't know, we used to be a house, kind of a very grand house belonging to a Jewish banking family on the Upper East Side, and kind of got transformed into a museum. But our space really still has the residue, or more than residue, of being kind of a domestic space with moldings and fireplaces and so on. And that's very appropriate to this exhibition, which is about a Jewish family. So it kind of has that stamp on it. And it's also kind of a very a rich kind of, it's an experience for all the senses in a way. It has an audio component. And we worked very closely on this exhibition with the architecture firm Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, and particularly with Liz Diller, one of the principals. And I can kind of talk a little bit about that as we go through. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and just kind of walk you through a little bit of the exhibition, but also give you a bit of background information that will hopefully enrich your experience when you do see the show in person. So here we are at the entrance. Mark the exhibition dates. Again, you do have several months to actually get down to the city and see this. We close on May 15th. This exhibition is called The Hair with Amber Eyes. And I'm gonna go to the next slide, which is a little bit wonky. But basically, this is a very unusual museum exhibition in that it is based on a book. And the book is the book that you see, at least partially at left, The Hair with Amber Eyes, A Hidden Inheritance, by Edmund Duvall. And this is a memoir that came out more than 10 years ago, actually, in 2010, that kind of became a global sensation. It's a little bit unusual. So just to kind of give you in very broad strokes the story, Edmund Duvall is a British ceramicist who inherited a collection of netsuke, including the eponymous Hair with Amber Eyes, which is the object you see at right. Netsuke are these very small, kind of intricately carved Japanese sculptures that actually were worn as part of the kind of, they would hang off of a belt on a kimono. So before people had like a pocket, they would have a purse, and the counterweight to the thing that was in their purse that kind of kept it on their belt were these little toggles. And so the Hair with Amber Eyes is one of these. Edmund inherited from his father, or actually through a whole kind of chain of succession, a collection of netsuke that had belonged to a cousin in the 19th century who had collected these things. And when he inherited, he actually became very curious about the history of these objects. So there were 264 of them. It wasn't part of a kind of a vast inheritance. He didn't get these 264 netsuke along with paintings and sculptures, and it wasn't that at all. And there's particular reasons for that. And he decided that he would trace these objects kind of through their journey through space and time, all the way back to the cousin who had collected them originally. And of course, beyond that and before that, they did originate in Japan. So our exhibition kind of takes Edmund's memoir as a point of departure, and really is kind of taking you through the same journey, again, kind of following these objects through space and time. The Netsuke also kind of become an interesting metaphor for a story that's really about diaspora. And Edmund's family is a Jewish family that kind of was in Europe in the 19th century and ultimately was kind of decimated and scattered by the Holocaust. And so that's kind of the story that we're telling as well. And these tiny objects kind of likewise, they start in one place, they begin in Japan, and they end up kind of fanning out all over the world. Again, I mentioned this is a family story. So Edmund's family is the Aphrusi family, and you kind of see this family tree here. If you look closely, you can see the first hair, which is that little kind of maroon icon, is with Charles. And Charles was, is kind of, you see upper left, a member of the Aphrusi family who lived in Paris in the 19th century. And he was the first person who collected these objects. You see them pass from Charles to his cousin Victor, from Victor then to his daughter Elizabeth, from Elizabeth to her brother Iggy, and then ultimately from Iggy, who's Edmund's great uncle, to Edmund. And so you're kind of tracing this journey through time of this collection. Here's Edmund kind of standing in the gallery after the show opened. And he's kind of, as I mentioned, he's a ceramicist, he's an artist himself. And I think that was actually, for me in reading his book, it really is a history that is told through objects. So starting with the Netsuke, but then really touching on a whole variety of different things as he moves through time. Edmund's family was kind of very wealthy, and they were art collectors. They built grand residences. And so there's a lot of very visually rich material that gets described kind of ekphrastically in the book. And we wanted to be able to offer that, but actually by bringing the objects into the space. So this is kind of like reading the book, but with 3D goggles on. So you're actually seeing some of the incredible objects that Edmund describes. The family story begins in Odessa, and I'm going to kind of touch on that very lightly. It's not really a part of the exhibition. It's not really a part of Edmund's book, but it's kind of the prehistory. So the Aphrusi originate in a place called Berdichev, which is kind of in the Pale of Settlement of the Russian Empire. And they migrate to Odessa to really launch their business. Odessa at this time is an amazingly cosmopolitan city. There are many Jews living there, but also Galicians and Poles and people from really all over the world. It's a port city. And the Aphrusi family starts to develop a business in as grain wholesalers. And there's a lot of kind of wheat coming in from Eastern Ukraine. You can kind of see, this is a very busy place. And also some quotations just to give you a sense of specifically what the Jewish experience was here. It's really seen as a place where, there's brothels and nightlife, and it's kind of a den of sin on the one hand, and it's also a place where Jews can really come and be prosperous. And so that is something that's interesting. It was not, however, free of anti-Semitism, and there were pogroms in Odessa. And that is one of the things that led the Aphrusi family to kind of leave the city and migrate to other places in Europe where they also were able to expand their business interests. The first of those places, the first place that we kind of touched down in the exhibition is Paris. So here you see the entrance to the Aphrusi's kind of grand building or grand residence that they had constructed on the Rue de Monceau in Paris. And this is the space as it appears today. So I'll say that one of the things that we wanted to do in creating this exhibition was, again, to parallel something that Edmund does, I think, very effectively in his book, which is to create the sense of time as almost porous, where you're living in the present moment, but you're also constantly in contact with the past, whether it's through objects that kind of came down to you or through architecture, to these different ways in which the past kind of really informs the present. And also the present really informs our experience of the past. So if you look closely on this kind of gorgeous marble staircase, you will see a real hallmark of certainly the past couple of years, which is a hand sanitizer dispenser. So this building, again, kind of once this grand residence, has become, in this case, I think, an office for medical insurance, which is quite a depressing thing in some ways, but also, this is the reality of kind of what happens to these incredibly grand spaces that we don't live this way anymore, essentially. So Edmund starts his journey in Paris, again, kind of going back to the place where this collection of netsuke, of these Japanese carvings, first entered his family. So I'll just read this quotation. Edmund is actually the audio track of this exhibition when you see it in person. So the idea is that you're kind of hearing his voice as it comes through in the book, as you actually see these things, but you'll have to accept me as a stand-in for the moment. One sunny April day, I set out to find Charles. Rue de Monceau is a long Parisian street bisected by the Grand Boulevard Malesherbes that charges off towards the Boulevard Pereire. It is a hill of golden stone houses, a series of hotels playing discreetly on neoclassical themes, each one a minor Florentine palace with heavily rusticated ground floors and an array of heads, caryatids, and cartouches. Number 81 Rue de Monceau, the Hotel Efroussi, is where my netsuke start their journey. It's near the top of the hill. I pass the headquarters of Christian Lacroix, and then next door, there it is. It is now rather crushingly an office for medical insurance. And so you see, he's starting this journey that ultimately takes him through the whole history of his family in this particular place. And we wanted to kind of represent these different architectural spaces, again, kind of in our own domestic architecture at the Jewish Museum. So this is actually the exhibition. So this is the gallery where we explore the family in Paris. You'll see kind of in the foreground a table, a vitrine full of the netsuke. And again, because this was kind of the central through line that Edmund uses to take people through the book, we also wanted to make that the case in the exhibition. So each of the main galleries has a table that has some of these netsuke. I'll just say a little bit more about them actually, because I realized I've kind of described what their function was, but I haven't really described what they look like, and you'll get a chance to see some of them up close later in the presentation. They are often very whimsical or very playful. They're depictions of ordinary things. So a hare, for example. It could also be somebody carving a barrel. It could be some rats playing together. It could be just a bundle of rope. Literally these very prosaic items. Sometimes they're a little bit more fantastic, a dragon or a demon catcher. And they're made in wood, different kinds of wood, or ivory for the most part. And you'll see kind of the different appearances that they have. And they're all, they can fit in the palm of your hand, basically. They're quite small for the most part. And actually that becomes very relevant as the story goes on, and we see kind of how these things move through space. So the family settles on the Rue de Monceau in Paris, which is kind of a neighborhood full of arriviste Jews, in fact. So people who are kind of coming to the city from elsewhere, whether from Egypt, from Odessa, from all over the place, and kind of establishing themselves. And again, kind of in a kind of a place in time when they had the freedom to do that. So they had the rights to kind of own property and do all these things that historically in other places in Europe maybe had been denied. This is this fantastic painting by Gustave Caillebotte, and one of the first characters that we meet in the exhibition is this character of Charles Efroussi. So he's kind of the third son. So the family relocates from Odessa to Paris, and they're setting up their banking dynasty. So they've gone from being grain wholesalers to being financiers and bankers. And basically, the oldest brother, he's needed in the bank. The second brother maybe goes into business as well. And by the time they get to their third son, they're kind of okay with letting him go and kind of do something else. And Charles does do many other things that have absolutely nothing to do with finance or business. Particularly, he becomes a great art historian. So he actually writes a monograph on Albrecht Dürer and becomes a great Dürer scholar. He travels all around Europe, kind of going from archive to archive and finding these amazing drawings and kind of prints and kind of putting all of this stuff together. But he also becomes a really important patron and critic of the arts of his time. And so, of course, Paris in the 19th century, Impressionism is kind of emerging, and Charles becomes a great friend of many of the Impressionist painters. He also owns and for a time edits the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, which is the most important art journal in Paris during this period. And he is an incredibly kind of deft and sensitive critic. So he's writing not only about Dürer and about kind of older artists, but also about his contemporaries. So Bert Morisot, Renoir, like all of these people he knew, he socialized with, and he supported their careers, not only as a critic, but also as a patron. So this, I think, this image to me is really about Charles, his sense of possibility. He's kind of in his space and looking out on the world. It's not actually a portrait of him, but it's one that we kind of included in the presentation just because it's very suggestive. These are two portraits of Charles Ephrussi. So to the left, a dry point by Jean Patricot from 1905. And then to the right, it's actually a posthumous portrait by Bonnat. And you can see he's a very elegant person with really very refined taste. At the same time, he is a young man in Paris during this time, indulging his passion for art and kind of decorative arts included with wild abandon and fueled by an enormous amount of money. So the possibilities, as you can imagine, are really quite endless. And to the right is this absolutely stupendous book that we borrowed from the Metropolitan Museum. It's kind of a vanity publication where they were looking at the great collections of Renaissance art of this time period. And Charles actually bought this bed that you see illustrated at right. The book itself is about 4 feet tall. It's absolutely crazy. And so he bought this Medici bed. And if you look closely, you'll see that there's a medallion kind of set into the tapestry at the back of the bed, which he had re-embroidered. So instead of an M for Medici, it had an E for Ephrussi. It's like absolutely nutty, kind of hard to imagine what kind of, I think he bought this when he was like 26 years old, what kind of person would acquire this object and have it in their home, let alone sleep in it. So really just quite a funny character. Charles was also kind of a salonier, so he kind of hosted the foremost intellectuals, writers, artists of his day in his home and socialized with them. And in fact, he became the inspiration for the character Charles Swann in Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. So he really was just out kind of in his time. Here I mentioned the Gazette des Beaux-Arts and Albrecht Dürer, both of these, so kind of ways in which he was engaged in culture. Here, just in case you need a reminder of Proust, this is a fantastic 80s production of Swann's Way. And here are the Netsuke. So Charles, as I say, was very much a man of his time. And as many of you will remember, Japonisme is this craze for Japanese art that sweeps Paris and indeed much of Western Europe in the mid-19th century. So in 1854, around Japan opens to global trade. And in 1867, there is the World's Fair in Paris has a Japanese pavilion. And kind of this introduces many French people and many Western Europeans to Japanese art and culture. And there is an absolute mania for it. So what happens is there are dealers who are traveling back and forth to Japan and kind of snapping up as much as they can, these objects, bringing them back, whether it's woodcuts, whether it's Netsuke, whether it's fabric. All of these things are kind of starting to flow into, certainly to Paris and to be collected. And so Charles definitely partook of this. And he actually collected the Netsuke from a single dealer, and he bought them as a lot. So it's a little bit deflating, actually. I want to think about his personality kind of lighting upon each one of these and buying them separately, but that's not the case. They kind of all come in at one time. I would say that the most of them date to the 19th century. I didn't mention that before. They had been made, I believe, since the 17th century. So you get for about 3 centuries. These are things that are kind of circulating around. And the quality does vary. I think many of them are very fine. Some of them are a little bit, were maybe made for the tourist market, are not quite as exquisite, excuse me. But again, you can see there's this real variety in kind of the shape, the color. And again, here's the eponymous hair. And just to give you, again, a sense of how wildly various these things are, you get this masked figurine. And if you look closely, you just see, it's kind of a whole universe that gets represented. So this is the business card, actually, of the dealer who sold this collection. And again, I say, it really was a mania where there was this exploding market in Japanese art and objects. And so this is the dealer that Charles acquired this collection from. And this is a scene from the World's Fair, as I mentioned. So here's like a Japanese tea house that's being staged. And you can see it's also impacting the art that's produced kind of in France during this time. And this is a very on the nose example of it. But you can see on the right is a kind of an actual Japanese woodcut, and then Van Gogh's, kind of rip-off version on the left. But it also kind of comes in a little bit more subtly, where you'll see Impressionist paintings that have elements of Japanese costume in them, kind of compositional techniques, etc. And so here's kind of a sampling of what we have on view in the show. As I said, Charles was a great collector. He snapped up, he had one of the most important collections of Impressionist art kind of in the time when Impressionist art was actually being produced. And he owned and kind of wrote about many of the most interesting kind of gorgeous paintings. This one, Bert Morisot, Young Girl in a Ball Gown, is on loan from the Musée d'Orsay. The Monet at right is from the Met, and both of these are kind of in the space to give you a sense of what Charles's very kind of richly appointed study would have looked like at this time. And he was also someone who supported artists by making connections for them. So he was obviously moving in, high society in Paris, and so he was somebody who introduced Renoir, for example, to the Cayen d'Anvers family, who would then go on to commission him for many portraits. So you'll see some of these examples as we move through. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, again, just to kind of give you a sense of how very present he was. He was a friend of Renoir. This is obviously a very famous painting found in the Phillips collection in Washington, Luncheon of the Boating Party. And if you look very closely, there's a figure in the back of the painting who looks a little bit incongruous. And that we're told is Charles. So he's kind of showing up at this gay outdoor summer gathering, but he's still wearing his top hat. And I think there's an interesting story here as well about what it meant to be Jewish in Paris during this time. So Charles definitely has entree through his money, through his connections, and yet he's also kind of held at a distance. And even friends, including Renoir, in fact, ended up kind of making him the butt of anti-Semitic comments, didn't kind of, when the going got tough, didn't necessarily fully embrace him. This is a fantastic anecdote, again, just to kind of illustrate how very connected he was. So Manet, also another kind of, absolutely indispensable 19th century artist. Charles bought this bundle of asparagus from Manet directly. When it arrived, he was so thrilled that he thought it was such a fantastic painting that he overpaid. It cost 800 francs or whatever, and he sent 1,000. And Manet, in response, sent this second painting, a single sprig of asparagus, and said, "This one seems to have slipped from the bundle." So you can really see there's a very kind of warm, intimate friendship between these two men. At the same time, Charles was eclectic in his tastes, and he certainly was not. You can already see that maybe if you're looking at someone who's writing about Albrecht Dürer, but then also is kind of very interested in Bert Morisot. But he also embraced symbolist artists like Gustave Moreau. This work, kind of right, called Jason, is also on loan from the Orsay. Really just an absolutely diametrically opposed style. Renoir walked into Charles's home and saw this and wrote this, again, kind of scathingly anti-Semitic. It's like, oh, I thought Charles Froussi had taste, but here he is buying this Jew art that's covered with gold. It's a very, it's quite shocking. But Charles was really Catholic in his taste, Catholic in the, not in the religious sense, but, he really kind of embraced this whole diversity and bought these extraordinary paintings that maybe hung strangely together, and certainly do hang strangely together in our space, but that also kind of represent the extent to which he was engaged with every facet of artistic production in Paris of his period. And here's that story. Other examples, and just to kind of jog your memories, at the end of the 19th century, the Dreyfus affair happens in France, and that's where there's a French Jewish army officer who's falsely accused of treason, who's excoriated in the press. It's an incredibly kind of divisive thing in French society. You have Émile Zola writing J'accuse, like defending Dreyfus. Anyway, there's a lot to be said about it. So here's in any case, a painting by Degas, which is a depiction of this rabbi who was kind of fought in the war as well. his son looks at this depiction and says, this is just a stereotyped kind of anti-Semitic portrait that is not about my father. It's really about kind of a racial smear. Anyway, here's Dreyfus. And the reason to mention these things is because, we're talking about a Jewish family that's incredibly wealthy, incredibly influential, and yet they are not above the fray. They too are impacted by anti-Semitism. And it doesn't at this point kind of inhibit their ability to, move in society, to kind of, be politically influential. And yet, it's still something that certainly touches their lives. And here's this quotation: "There's a certain methodical fairness in anti-Semitism. It targets rich and poor Jews alike." We're going to move into Vienna now. So I mentioned that the exhibition kind of travels along with Edmund's book through time and space. So some of the family goes to Paris to set up a business there. And we focused on Charles because he was such a fascinating character. In Vienna, the focus is more diffuse. So we're looking at a number of different family members. And we're also really interested in how they made a claim to membership in Viennese society through architecture. And they, as in Paris, they kind of decided to build their residence in a very up and coming area, the Ringstrasse. So this is a place that at the time was, the opera house in Vienna was being built here, the university, and also all of these very kind of opulent private residences. And here you see again this photograph that shows the interior of the Uffizi residence in Vienna as it is today. No hand sanitizer dispenser in this one, but if you look closely, you'll see kind of other marks like the HVAC system, and these things are kind of cue you to the fact that the past is kind of existing in the present. So the family kind of patriarch, Victor and Emmy, and these are the members of the family who end up inheriting or receiving these Netsuke actually as a wedding present from cousin Charles. So Victor and Charles grew up together. They were children in Odessa together. And then Charles makes the decision to send his collection Netsuke actually together with a vitrine, not the vitrine you see at right, but a vitrine that contains them to Vienna. And so this is kind of a very interesting thing for him to do. The house in Vienna is a little bit stuffy, and maybe you can get a sense of that from that image. The one in Paris is maybe a little bit more delicate, refined, and subtle. And in Vienna, it's just absolute kind of out and out Gu Rothschild style. So it's like the Rothschild's taste for, things that today we might think of as garish or over the top. And the Netsuke are these very kind of quiet, subtle objects. And they actually have trouble figuring out where these things are going to go. Ultimately, they land, and I think this is very, very interesting, in Emmy's dressing room. So she is, again, this kind of splendidly dressed person that you see at center. She marries into the family, and the Netsuke end up in this very private space. It's one that she also spends a lot of time in, though. And Edmund talks in the book about, it takes hours to get dressed to go out when you have corsets and kind of layers of garments and your hair is being done and all these things. So the dressing room is actually, an important place for her, but it's also one where these things are not kind of available to the public in the same way. There are also kind of wonderful anecdotes that Edmund tells about the Netsuke being toys for the children. So they have 3 children, and all of them end up playing with these things. Kind of, they're able to take them out, and you can imagine how they would be really quite wonderful as children's toys. I'm not going to read this, but this is kind of Edmund describing the kind of over-the-top grandeur of this place. And here you see the exterior with the votive Kirche, the votive church in Vienna, kind of there in the background. There's something really interesting too about these buildings. So there's a style of building that's very common to this flat, where you don't occupy the whole of this space, but you create this very, very grand facade, and then you can let out some of the other spaces as apartments for other families or for businesses, etc. So you kind of get a sense of this. And it's also very central to Vienna. So they really are, again, kind of, they're moving in from Odessa, and they're making claim. They engage a Viennese architect. They kind of work in this neoclassical style. They select a site for the building that's, kind of all is kind of staking a claim to membership in Viennese society of a particular kind. And here you see, again, kind of these patriarch, or the patriarch and the matriarch, who kind of came over from Odessa. And they're not, I should say, there's, again, we kind of talked about the character of the Jews in the city really varies very widely in this period. So this is the Stadttempel in Vienna. And it's a very, very interesting building. So in the time when it was built, Jews were not permitted to build houses of worship in the inner city of Vienna, except that this one was, they were allowed to do it because there was no entrance from the street. So it's kind of behind an apartment building. It's this very strange kind of concealed space. So it's very, it's very beautiful and it's kind of very thoughtfully done, but it's also kind of concealed. And it's actually, for that reason, it survived the Nazi period, because again, it was attached to these other apartment buildings. Jews like the Ephrussis, who were kind of, high-toned, wealthy Jews, would have belonged to a temple like this one. So they would have been worshiping in this space that was, again, kind of very grand and elegant. But there were also smaller houses of worship that would have been frequented by, Jews who had come in from Eastern Europe, and kind of never the twain shall meet. It was, not kind of an integrated Jewish world. And yet the Ephrussi were also kind of patrons and protectors of, the poorer Jews who were, peddlers and kind of doing other things in the city that were not kind of underwriting the Austro-Hungarian Empire as financiers, for example. So they're connected and they're also separate. It's important to say. And one of the ways that they kind of maintain their connection to the Jewish community was by kind of commissioning or having made these very beautiful items. So the one at left actually was not commissioned by a member of the Ephrussi family, although, again, kind of one of the ways that they ended up integrating themselves into Viennese society was by marrying into Jewish families in Vienna who had been there for longer, who were also kind of prosperous and prominent. And so the Torah curtain at left was commissioned by one of those families. In fact, it's made of the train of a wedding dress, which was traditional at that time. So you see this gorgeous silk, like richly embroidered. And this would have hung in that temple that we saw. The Ephrussi, members of the Ephrussi family were kind of married before this. It's a Torah ark curtain. So the Torahs are stored in the ark in the synagogue, and then you pull the curtain over it when they're not in use. And this is kind of the thing that you would see. And to the right, there's a Torah mantle, which actually was commissioned by members of the Ephrussi family and specifically by the women. So it has this dedicatory inscription that associates it with the family. So I talked about the architecture again, like this is an elevation drawing by the architect Theophil von Hansen. And you kind of see this immense scale and kind of how impressive this building was. And we wanted to bring in these fantastic designs. So it's all kind of an integrated decorative program. So there's an architect, and they also engaged an artist to do panel paintings that would be kind of incorporated into the decor. So that person is Christian Griepenkurl. This is actually a typo in the caption. And most of them are kind of very expected for this period. They're kind of classical themes. In the music room, you had the muses painted on the ceiling and kind of stuff like that. But there's one really kind of fascinating exception. And this actually, it comes in the ballroom. So it's in a way, it's the most public room in the house. And for that space, the Ephrussis decided to commission these paintings of the story of Esther. And of course, Esther is a story about a Jewish person who kind of integrates into Gentile society and ends up, protecting the Jews. So I think it's very, very moving and very interesting that that was what they chose to kind of sneak in for someone who was paying attention. They would look up, and instead of seeing, kind of Cupid or Zeus or whatever, they would see instead this kind of biblical tale that is specifically about, again, the relationship between Jews and Gentiles and kind of Jewish kind of self-protection and the articulation of power. Here you're seeing the family again, the children, Victor and Emmy. Here's Emmy greeting an archduke in Vienna. So again, kind of thinking about both her splendid kind of sartorial sense, but also the great importance that the family had in the culture of their time. I'll kind of add that there's a flip side to this, and you'll kind of see what's coming. So, they're kind of on the losing side in World War I. So the fortunes of the family actually changed before World War II, and they've really kind of put a lot into supporting, kind of the losing cause here. And just some other items that kind of illustrate their lifestyle. We have this opera fan, these wonderful, kind of very wonderful Art Nouveau drawings. This is an anniversary album, so something that was commissioned from an artist, kind of depicting members of the family. And we also have these items from the Ephrussi art collection. Actually, I'm going to pause for just a minute. I'm hearing one of my children being a little bit louder than I can continue to focus on my presentation through. So they were also collecting art by kind of Germanic artists during this period. So it was very, very interesting, because when we put together the Paris room of this show, it was very, these were in some cases paintings that were very well known to us, just kind of as curators and art historians. I had actually shown one of them before in an exhibition of Impressionist painting. It was like very top of mind. Whereas the artists that the Ephrussi family collected in Vienna, by and large, were people that I had never heard of, and even Stephen, my colleague who focuses on 19th century art, was totally unaware of. So these are not things that have kind of retained their popularity, certainly not in the US. These are not the things that we think of when we think of 19th century art. In any case, I think, for us, when we were looking at this collection, part of what we saw was kind of a patriotic move, where, again, by collecting these artists, by living in Vienna and collecting, kind of Austrian artists or Austro-Hungarian artists, German artists, that's a way of, again, kind of tacking your own identity to the place that you live and work. And I think they did that in a very powerful way. And again, so that the Ephrussis end up inheriting these Netsuke. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kids, because, again, we're kind of tracing the path of the family. So this is actually Edmund's grandmother. So Edmund, again, is the author of this book. He's the one who kind of ends up with these Netsuke and kind of tracing them back through past. And Elizabeth is the member of the family who is his grandmother, and she's quite an extraordinary figure. So she is one of the first women to receive a doctorate in law from the University of Vienna, but she's also a poet and a writer. She's just a really kind of fascinating character. There she is, a true intellectual. She was also a friend of Rilke, which is quite wonderful. And her brother, Iggy Ephrussi, he's actually the one who ends up inheriting the collection of Netsuke from his father and his mother. And he is also a very interesting character. So everyone is exiled. And I'm sorry, I'm moving a little bit jerkily at this point, but so World War I happens. The family is in Vienna. Their fortunes change. Nostalgia sets in. It's no longer the sense that anything that they have they want and can collect, but they do kind of retain these objects that they've had through the centuries. After World War I, that really changes, and there's a sense that they're certainly not impoverished, but they're not actively collecting in the same way. After the war, everyone scatters, and that's kind of the next chapter of this. Iggy actually leaves Vienna. He becomes like a dress designer. He ends up serving in the American Army. There's like a lot of kind of interesting things to say about him, and eventually, in fact, takes up residence in Tokyo. Gisela ends up in Mexico, and Rudolph ends up in the United States. So there are actually 4 children, kind of scattered to the winds. This is the Anschluss. So in March of 1938, the Nazis kind of come into Vienna, kind of claim it as part of the Reich. And at this point, of course, even well-established Jews like the Ephrussis become the targets of kind of state-sponsored anti-Semitism. So here's, again, the painting collection that you see. And at the left, you'll see a list of paintings that are seized from the Ephrussi residence in Vienna at this time. And of course, you're looking at Nazi bureaucracy. Everything is always meticulously documented, even though it's bald-faced looting, like that's what this is. But everything is itemized and everything is kind of tucked away. We also have in the exhibition correspondence between museum directors, so people who are in receipt of these stolen artworks and kind of deciding, oh, this belongs, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, this might go to the Military History Museum, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very, it's kind of extraordinary to have these things that really tell in absolutely, sharp detail what the fate of these objects were after they were removed. So the family is exiled and they leave. Victor and Emmy do make it out. So at the time of the Anschluss, Elizabeth, Edmund's grandmother, is already living in London. She got married to a Dutchman, Hendrik de Waal, and was living in London. And she ultimately is able to secure a visa for her parents to come. Emmy commits suicide before she gets there. But Victor does make it to England and lives with the family there for the last years of his life. And you can see here his passport, which has the good for a single entry stamp. So this is the visa that they're finally able to secure to get him out. I mentioned that Iggy in particular joins the army. So he's living in the United States. He ends up joining the army. And of course, because he's a fluent German speaker, he's invaluable. He becomes a translator, and you see him left kind of interpreting on behalf of the American military. He was also, kind of one of those nice human interest stories during the war. People obviously Americans found it very encouraging and kind of wanted to read about this Austrian baron who had kind of come to the US and joined the Allied cause. And this is just again to kind of follow the trajectory of the Netsuke. You may be wondering, all of these paintings are looted from the residence in Vienna. What happens to this collection of tiny sculptures? So the family legend, and this is something that Edmund kind of describes in the book, is that there was a maid who stayed on in the house. So it was taken over and became kind of an office for the Nazis in Vienna. And there was this maid who stayed on, and she saw all of this looting. She saw all of these things going on, and she realized that nobody was really paying attention to these things. And she took them and hid them in her mattress with the intention of returning them to the family after the war. And so the suitcase is actually, all of the Netsuke were, again, this is the family legend, get shoved into this suitcase and kind of make it to London. No one has been able to kind of find who this person actually was. So it's a bit of an apocryphal story, possibly. But one way or another, these objects did survive, which is extraordinary no matter how it happened. Again, kind of given the fact that everything from Victor's library to their painting collection to their tables and chairs was either destroyed or expropriated. So there's something. There's a bit of a mystery here, but also the suitcase kind of is a representation of that. And after the war, the Netsuke actually ended up returning to Tokyo. So Iggy, after he leaves the army, is in business and is offered the possibility of going to Belgian Congo, I think, or to Tokyo. And he picks Tokyo, never thinking that he'll stay for very long. But ultimately, he meets his life partner, a Japanese man named Jiro Sugiyama, and they spend the rest of their lives together in Tokyo and kind of set up a very beautiful, a beautiful life, like aesthetically beautiful. So they have these kind of gorgeous mid-century interiors, and you see the vitrine at the back actually is holding the Netsuke. And they live in a series of apartments in Tokyo. So here's Jiro. And here's kind of a closer view where you can actually see the Netsuke displayed in his home, in their home. And it's obviously there's a real kind of poetic turn that this takes, where these objects that had left Japan in the mid-19th century have traveled to Paris, have traveled from Paris to Vienna, from Vienna to London, and then ending up all the way back kind of close to where they began in Japan. And among these other East Asian antiquities, which Jiro and Iggy collected. It's a very, very strange and kind of unexpected turn of events. Edmund actually meets the Netsuke for the first time when he's a student in Japan. So I mentioned that he's a ceramicist. When he was in his 20s, he got a scholarship to kind of leave England and go to study in Japan for a time. And of course, he his family, mom and dad were saying, well, you got to find Uncle Iggy, go find Uncle Iggy. So he ends up getting to know his great uncle and his partner Jiro Sugiyama through this time, and becoming quite close to him. And here you can see them together in the apartment. So Iggy is in his 80s at this point, but is still kind of a very lively companion. I'm going to end actually here and talk a little bit about where the Netsuke end up next, because for Edmund, again, the story really kind of starts and ends with the Netsuke. So this is Edmund's father, Victor de Waal, who came over. So Elizabeth is his mother, the one who got the law degree. She moves to England, and so Victor is actually born in England, and it becomes a minister in the Church of England, and ultimately the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral, which is quite an important role. I think what's interesting, why we wanted to end with this portrait, it's something that has a lot of kind of emotional resonance for Edmund. So this painting was commissioned by the cathedral, but it's a tradition for 500 years. Every Dean of Canterbury has had their portrait painted. The deans kind of have a say in who paints that portrait. So Victor, for his portrait, selected an elderly painter who was also kind of a distant cousin of his, who had also left Vienna and kind of ended up in England. That's Marie-Louise Montesquieu. And so when the painting was unveiled, Victor looked at it and thought, oh my God, she's made me look like a rabbi. And of course, he's not Jewish, he's not a rabbi, he's kind of a clergyman in the Church of England. But she shared this past with him and could see that even though he had moved kind of, across a continent from one place to another, he really was still very deeply rooted in kind of Jewish tradition, and certainly in the aspect of Jewish tradition and Jewish experience that was about exile and diaspora and movement and kind of never belonging wholly to one place. So I think that was something that Edmund really wanted to represent kind of at the conclusion of the exhibition, and also to give us a way to think again about the Netsuke as objects and also as kind of a metaphor. A couple years back, the family decided, so again, Edmund kind of inherits these from his great uncle Iggy. And, there have been so many crises in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, it's almost hard to keep track, but they felt very keenly around the time of the Syrian refugee crisis. There are all these migrants that are kind of flowing into Europe from various places around the world. And he and his children decided to sell a portion of the collection of Netsuke to fund refugee charities that serve refugee children. And so that's something that, is obviously not taken lightly. This is something that had been in their family at this point for over 150 years, but it was something that they felt was kind of the right move to make, a public gesture to really think about the history of the family as embodied in these Netsuke and kind of how they could kind of mobilize that in a concrete way. And so that's what they did. So 79 of the Netsuke were sold at auction, again, I think it was about 4 years ago, and raised quite a bit of money for the Refugee Council. So it's kind of an ongoing story, like the Netsuke continue moving in space and time, but they do become this portal through which you can talk about the history of this family and kind of also think about the ways, again, in which the past is present in our lives in these concrete, palpable ways. You can kind of touch it and feel it, and yet there's always going to be something kind of mute and elusive about it as well. So I think I'll stop there. And take questions from anybody who might have something they want to talk about in greater depth, whether it's about the show or about an item in the show or about the book. I'll stop my share here.
I'll actually jump in first. I'll abuse my platform. So in the interest of saving time, you skipped over the Marcel Proust page. What did we miss there?
What did you miss? I mean, I think, bringing Proust into the show is really just another way of registering how ubiquitous Charles was as a personality, kind of in Paris of his time. And again, kind of in these elite artistic and kind of intellectual circles. So, he was a friend of Marcel Proust, who ultimately was kind of immortalized. as one of the inspirations for this very famous character of Charles Swann, who, and that character, if you're familiar with the book, is also kind of an embodiment of this incredibly worldly, cultured personality that, you know, kind of has beautiful things and does beautiful things. And so I think that's why that's in there. It's just this member of the family actually achieved kind of pop culture, what counts as pop culture with that time period status. Yeah.
I'm going to read a question out loud. It is, did Elizabeth hide her Jewishness from her children to the point that her son becomes such a highly regarded member of the clergy of another faith?
So Elizabeth actually converted to, so she married a Dutchman who was Lutheran. They moved to England together, and then ultimately the two of them joined the Church of England. And she was always engaged with her Jewish identity. She certainly never hid it from her children. And, you know, of course, when you think about what so many of our families experienced during, you know, the World War II period, it's there are many things that kind of get shut away, you know, because they're painful, because they're difficult. But I don't think it was obfuscation, or, you know, it was something where Victor was raised in the Church of England and ultimately became a clergyman, but he was always aware to some degree of the history of the family. Yeah.
I'll ask another question in the meantime. Take us back to the curatorial exploits. How did this all come about? And
yeah, oh my gosh.
The hardest, I mean, we didn't get to, of course, you didn't get to include everything. What were some of the hardest things to give up on in that show?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so I kind of touched on it in the beginning, but this is a really, really unusual exhibition, not only in that it is an exhibition that is based on a book. And actually, this is kind of a truism among curators. Like, you don't want to do an exhibition that should be a book or that is a book. Like, that's not, they're two different species of kind of, you know, product, and you don't want to confuse them. But as I say, in this case, we felt like what we had in Edmund's book was a story that was already so infused with and kind of woven around objects that kind of translating that into an exhibition did make sense on some level. And the checklist kind of wrote itself because there are so many items that he actually mentions in the book. At the same time, and I should have mentioned this also, this exhibition, there are like many points of origin. One is our director, Claudia Gould, actually reading Edmund's memoir, The Hair with Amber Eyes, in 2010 and thinking this would be a fantastic show for the Jewish Museum. Another is Edmund donating the family archive to the Jüdisches Museum in Vienna. So that's the Jewish Museum in Vienna. And he felt that that institution was one where, you know, they could really kind of be the stewards of the Afouzzi family legacy in perpetuity. And the Jüdisches Museum actually did a show a couple years ago based on this material, again, kind of the material in the family archive. And you see some of that in the show. So things like, you know, the album, like Victor's passport, there are, you know, the Judaica items that kind of came through the family. All of those things are with the Jüdisches Museum in Vienna and kind of were loaned to us for this exhibition. So that's kind of another piece. Their exhibition was much more focused on the historical context, on kind of the, you know, charting a kind of a giving a more precise and expansive sense of how the Afouzis were a part of the culture of the city, and also of kind of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and kind of the Europe more broadly at that time. Our exhibition is aimed to be much more experiential, much more imbued with the sense of something deeply personal, which I think is part of what's so attractive about Edmund's book. So he is very much kind of present in the narrative. You know, there's not like an anonymous narrator. He's really talking about telling the story because it emerges out of a sense of curiosity and interest that he has from this very particular thing that happens to him, where he inherits these particular objects. So we wanted to really bring that in as much as we could. And so, as I mentioned, Edmund's voice is actually kind of guiding you through the show. There's kind of an audio component, so you're actually hearing him talk about these things as you see them. Sorry, there's so much here. the next piece of the puzzle is we worked very closely with Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro. And some of you may have read, there was a great Times piece where Liz Diller was talking about why she chose to do this project. So she too is the product, or is the, excuse me, the child of Jews who were in Europe during the Holocaust. So her parents were survivors. It's not something they talked about very much, but she was born in Europe and kind of came to the United States and kind of has this is also this story of kind of exile and upheaval is also a part of who she is. And so I think being able to work on this project was really kind of a very important experience for her. It's not something that she's talked about a lot publicly before, but this show really kind of gave her a chance to think through some of those things that maybe she wasn't able to certainly in her work as an architect to kind of work on before. And so the exhibition design, again, the goal of it was to be evocative of the domestic spaces in which the Ephrussis lived over time and in different spaces, and also to kind of cite that within, again, this kind of this third place. So, you know, the Jewish Museum, again, were a former domestic space. We're kind of bringing in these other experiences from other places and times. I would say just in terms of the challenges of working on it, part of it was just negotiating all of these different actors and kind of creators in the space. So, you know, it was Stephen and I, the curatorial team for the museum, Liz and her team from Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, so the architects and designers. Edmund, of course, was really, really vital and was an incredibly kind of gracious and generous collaborator. You know, he really turned over the keys to his book, which was, you know, really required, I think, a lot of trust and kind of goodwill and also just humbleness, sort of, to be able to do that, especially when the story that he tells is such a personal one. But trying to kind of shape all of these different voices into a coherent vision. And then on the level of the objects, I will say there were some things that we would have liked to include that for various reasons we were not able to. So for example, this really gorgeous table that kind of, you know, you saw that kind of gilt interior of the house in Vienna. Well, of course, there was furniture to match. So we had wanted to kind of be able to represent certainly, you know, some of the furniture that they owned in these different spaces. And there are a couple things that you'll see in both in the Paris gallery and in the Vienna gallery. But, you know, for example, Charles also owned this insane, like 9-foot high planisphere clock. It's like a, you know, this just absolutely bonkers, you know, Louis XV thing. And, you know, we couldn't, it wasn't possible for that to travel. That's in the Getty collection in LA. There were other items in Vienna that we wanted to bring that we couldn't bring. So, you know, that's always in curatorial work. That's something you come up against, especially when you're dealing with kind of older objects. Things are fragile and they can't travel, or, you know, for various reasons, it's just not possible to bring everything in. You'll also see the space is super crammed, and part of that was an aesthetic choice. We wanted to, again, kind of evoke the kind of coziness or the kind of a more domestic mode of display for these items than what you would typically find in a museum. And part of it was just that we had so much that we wanted to show in such a limited space to show it in. So it really is very, very dense. Yeah.
Thank you. If you can spare the time, we have 2 more questions. Is that
Sure.
good by you? Great. So it is, could you talk a bit about the dispersal of the Ephrussi collections by the Nazis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, this is, I actually don't know as much about like who was still, I don't know the history of the descendants of the French part of the family and what happened to those items, but in Vienna, you know, they came in, they itemized everything. And then, as I say, you know, much of the art collections were kind of either sold off or kind of placed in different state museums. And some of them actually are still being restituted. You know, one of the paintings that actually ended up in the gallery, and you'll see it on the wall, I didn't kind of highlight it, had been in the collection of the Military History Museum since World War II, and was in the midst still of you know, kind of legal, it was being it was in the process of being restituted. So there was a lawsuit brought by the family, and they were trying to go through the legal processes to have it returned. And ultimately, during the time that we were working on the show, they succeeded, and the painting was officially restituted. And so the museum would not have been able to loan it to us because it was, kind of entangled in these kind of legal proceedings. But the family, when it was legally returned to them, was willing to lend it to us for the show, which was just an amazing way to be able to look at how long it has taken to kind of, it's still an ongoing process to try and restore and kind of untangle the incredible mess that was made by the Nazis as they stole property around Europe. So it's really kind of an extraordinary thing. Yeah,
a whole exhibition on itself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's see, here you go. Is there a resource or record of photographs of all the Netsuke we can find and look at from the time that part of the collection was sold?
That is a good question. If you are very ardently interested, you can find it is online, I'm pretty sure, the auction at which those Netsuke were sold. There were 79 of them again. I do believe that is online. And we actually include images of those 79 Netsuke in a projection at the close of the exhibition, just to kind of, again, kind of round out the story. And if you're particularly curious about them, I think you can find them, including individual images, online. The museum has not made publicly available, high quality images of the rest of the Netsuke. But there are a couple of them on the website, and then again, kind of almost all of them that are still with the family are on display in the museum right now.
Well, I think I speak on behalf of everyone by saying that this has just been exhilarating, and thank you so much, Shira. Is everybody able to applaud, to unmute themselves and applaud? Oh, well, we see a lot of hands. And so with the thanks, I also very much want to extend our gratitude to our sponsors, Lois and Bruce Zenkel, and to remind that on January 11th at 7:30 in the evening, our next program in the series is Tainted Glory in Handel's Messiah, and it's with the musicologist Michael Marison. So please join us for that. And again, Shira, thank you so much. You so intimately brought us into the world of this exhibition and of your work. So true thanks.
My pleasure. And again, it really is. This is a taste, and I would encourage anyone who is able and who feels safe doing so to come down to the museum. Again, this show is open through May 15th, so you do have some time. Hopefully, the weather and other conditions outside will improve, and we can all kind of be together in person again. So thank you very much for joining us virtually today, and hope to see you in the museum soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shira. Thank you everyone for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful.